Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another webinar for Receivables Info. Today, I'm joined by my friend, Brooke Teal, who is the Vice President of Legal and Compliance with Everchain. How you doing today, Brooke?
Hey Adam, I'm doing well. How about you?
Absolutely wonderful today. For anybody who hasn't had a chance to meet you yet, could you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat that you're in today?
Sure. Like Adam said, I am the VP of Legal and Compliance at Everchain. I have been in the industry for 9 years now. I started at Midland as an in-house attorney. Then I went to Jefferson Capital as an in-house attorney as well. And then I was at Lloyd & McDaniel as a lead attorney litigating collections cases. So I've been in the debt buyer space for quite some time. Now I'm at Everchain, and we are a compliance platform for debt sales. And we also help broker the deals between our sellers and buyers. We have a certified network of sellers and buyers, and we perform audits and vendor management with everyone within our network.
Well, and that's why I wanted to have this chat with you here today about vendor management. We also had another gentleman who was joining us this morning, Marc Johnston with Harvest Strategy Group, who was having some technical difficulties. So we're, but the show must go on. So here we go. I think one of the important things for us to talk about here is what vendor management was in 2007 and what it's ultimately become. And I hate to date myself as having been through all of that, but you do kind of see some patterns and cycles in the evolution of compliance. For those of you that are not familiar with me, I've spent a lot of time in the debt buying space as well, as a debt buyer, as a broker, as a compliance management system, writing policies and procedures and software for debt buyers to manage their vendors. And I got to start working in that space as the CFPB was born and as the receivables management industry was starting to take hold of all of these changes that were coming down. And so I started thinking about this in terms of a balance, because I remember the first time I wrote policies and procedures for a client, I walked into their office with the 1,500-page document that was outlining all the things that they were going to have to do going forward. And when I did that, the CEO looked at me and he said, "I'm going to have to hire like 100 people to manage this. Like, how am I going to do that?" And that was kind of what prompted, I think, a lot of organizations, when they realized how restrictive things were becoming and how detailed the management of each aspect was going to be, that kind of prompted where we stand today. So for me, I always kind of looked at that balance of the performance and the compliance, because compliance is or was originally viewed as a sunk cost. And early on, a lot of organizations used compliance as a marketing catch. Like, look how compliant we are. But I think as we talk about the evolution over time, now it's table stakes, right? It's the ante to sit at the poker table. Like, if your whole deck is talking about compliance when you're pitching a creditor, they are just not looking at it the same way, right? They're like, this is table stakes. Like, why are you still talking about this? So I think over this time period, compliance has become one of those things that has become so deeply ingrained in our organizations that it's just part of who we are now, versus something that we had to do. And I know you were a little bit more on the litigation side at that time, but you've definitely ridden the wave of compliance and compliance responsibility within organizations. How have you experienced kind of that evolution from the 2007 mind frame to where we stand today?
I mean, it's definitely, like you said, shifted from performance. Performance is obviously important. Why do we have vendors if we're not trying to perform? But compliance is the major aspect now, and I think we've seen a big shift into written communications, call frequencies, retention standards, validating balances. These things weren't really cared as much about years ago as now. It's the main bread and butter of what we're focusing on now when it comes to vendor management and having a centralized process. So I think it's just we can really see the shift from performance to compliance as regulation has increased.
There's definitely been a change now, but now that you're sitting on the other side and you're working with these creditors and helping them to understand, risk levels, risk tolerance, kind of like what's happening on that side of the world, how are they viewing it today, right? Like how are the creditors looking at the compliance requirements?
You know what I keep hearing from our creditors is the customer experience, and compliance is so involved in that. They spend so much time, so much effort making sure that their customers have a good experience when they're
Hmm.
lending, right? After they sell the debt, they also want to make sure that customer has a good experience. And if they sell to a non-compliant buyer, if that buyer has vendors that are engaging in shady practices, that customer is going to have a terrible experience, and that lender is going to be on, their brand is on the hook for that
Hmm.
behavior. So I think the customer experience really kind of ties in with the vendor management and what we're doing with it.
And I think as you start to look at some of the alternative marketplace, lending, fintechs, and other things, in a lot of instances, these consumers can be rehabilitated, and the lender doesn't necessarily want their brand to get dragged through the mud when there's still so much opportunity to re-engage with those consumers and to create a more positive overall relationship with that individual, because the relationship with the bank doesn't necessarily end at charge off. They remember where they got that loan in a lot of instances, and the behavioral patterns that come and how they're treated in recovery and collections is how they're going to remember the experience. They're not going to remember how easy it was to take out an application, right? They're going to remember the
Absolutely.
difficulties that they went through from a collection cycle standpoint. But now, as we talk a little bit about how vendor management has evolved over time, I think that there's some interesting things, some interesting trends that have started to emerge when it comes to how are we working with those vendors, and those vendors being an extension of our business to communicate with those consumers. And we talked a little bit about the dual approach and the balance of performance and compliance, but I really do see it as a balance, because there's you
Right.
can put more restrictions in place from a compliance standpoint, which will affect what people are able to do from a performance standpoint. And I think the more that you're able to automate some of that, or leverage digital tracking tools and other tool sets that would enable you to manage that with less physical labor, actually can find an appropriate balance. Because it's one thing if you were manually tracking 7 and 7, right? But when it's being done by the computer system, yes, it's a restriction, but you're mitigating the performance risks or the performance deficit that starts to exist because of a restriction on the compliance side. So that balance back and forth, I think, has become. It's hard to build into matrix, but I know I've looked at a lot of KPIs through the years of where organizations are starting to measure. I add this to the compliance side. How does it affect my performance? I add this to the performance side. How does it affect the risk tolerance I'm willing to accept on the performance side?
Yeah, and I think having, clear guidelines, clear policies, clear KPIs, clear tracking, which can be automated, is the way that you best balance both sides of
Mhm.
that, right? That's the way you keep your vendors compliant. That's also the way you track to make sure they're performing that you want to. So you want to make sure that everything's centralized, everything's clear, your contracts are clear with each vendor, and you're tracking. Tracking is the only way we know if you're performing and if you're performing compliantly. And putting those policies in place is so vital at
Mhm.
the beginning,
Well, reporting and measurement is everything, right? You got to set up these
Yeah.
KPIs, which are the criteria by which you're evaluating performance, and then you need to track, measure, and report on the variance between your expectation and ultimately the results that are being achieved, whether that be from a compliance or a performance standpoint. But I think building out those criteria and walking into each one of these relationships. Now, I think the change in the evolution was that I don't think things were as clear up front, and people were making a lot of tweaks and changes to their programs in order to measure, success rates or risk tolerance levels. But now I think you find yourself in a little bit of a different scenario as we kind of look at this over a timeline. Because now, as things have become more refined, now you can have these clear guidelines. You have your way of doing it. It's established. It's proven. And now I think the confidence level in the compliance aspects has increased exponentially over the last 15 years.
Definitely.
So here, this is one that I kind of want to toss out to you, Brooke, because you spend a lot more time in the process of vetting agencies and law firms. And just for those that are watching, part of what Everchain is doing is actually doing these centralized compliance. I believe you call it universal due diligence, right? Which is kind of like, here's our standard expectations across the board. Do you measure up to these expectations? And not at it's not like a balance sheet that's a snapshot in time, right? Like you're looking at this over in a longer period. Can you elaborate a little bit on kind of what universal due diligence is and how you've applied that to vetting the agency and vendors that the debt buyers are using?
Absolutely. So yeah, at Everchain we have a network of debt buyers, right? So if you want to buy debt on our platform, you have to be in our network. We have this closed ecosystem of compliant buyers. So we have an application that requires licensing, COAs, insurance, SOPs, everything that kind of gives us a snapshot of your business to see if you're able to perform compliantly within our network. After that, we perform yearly audits. So it's a centralized, application and centralized standards for everyone within our network. What we do then is we take all the information and put it into what we call our UDD in our platform. So that way, if you are a seller and you are, selling your debt on our platform and you see the bids come in, you can go and look and look at their due diligence without having to do that on your own. It takes the lift out of all of that auditing and all of that vendor management because we've already done it for you. You can go see it in real time. So it's really just a way of, what we're just saying, centralizing all guidelines and making everything easy to see in one place. So that way our lenders will know what kind of buyers they're selling to and, what kind of risk is involved with that buyer.
Well, what kind of KPIs are you using to measure that? Right. So I think that there's some standard criteria that we see across the board, and that's going to be those things like the, I gotta describe this, like when we talk about kind of some of these standard pieces, and then you're kind of building on top of what is a standard expectation for individual clients, or is it all just this is the package? Like this is the expectation.
I mean, we obviously have minimum standards, right? And then, when we're going through our audits, we're seeing physical security, just kind of looking at the business as a whole to see where there could be any risks. And when we do audits, it really improves the entire network. If we see that there's room for improvement in certain areas, we can let them know. And it kind of elevates the entire network where we can see if there's anything that could be improved in any way that buyer could make themselves more compliant. Really, to elevate the entire industry. I think we've all made so many improvements in this industry, and we are all, working with regulation as it comes, and it is just making the industry better. I think we're all improving each other, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I think everybody improving each other is a big part of it. Oh, I can't tell if it's my internet or looks like okay. We had a little internet glitch. I apologize for talking over you there. So when we talk about the, kind of setting that same standard, and then you've got kind of add-ons to that. One of the things that I find interesting from a buyer perspective in terms of being able to move deals along quickly when you're talking about it from a debt buyer's perspective is that you're doing a lot of this stuff up front, meaning like you have to get certified and cleared basically to be able to participate in the deals or the potential opportunities in the first place. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct.
So
Yeah.
that shortens the time period by which a deal can be executed. So after an auction or a sale has taken place, you're now going to have, an ability to move very quickly on execution because the minimum standards or the expectations of not only the buyer but the vendors that buyer will use are all kind of baked into one.
Absolutely. Yep. That all the vendor management work has already been done.
So let me ask you this, this is where the internet kind of dropped off, was about the KPIs, right? What kind of KPIs are being used to manage these or to measure kind of these vendors and debt buyers?
It's totality of the circumstances. I see it
Okay.
as if there happens to be a complaint, how quickly is that vendor getting back? If there's an issue, how quickly are they responding? What is their physical security like? Their insurance, their policies and procedures. It's kind of just the whole picture of the business as a whole is really what we're looking at.
And so now that we've started to move into the Reg F world or the post Reg F world, right? Digital communications has become one of these larger aspects. And with digital communications, right, when we're sending out letters, we have a template. The template gets checked. Everybody's happy. We move forward with it. But how are we handling that same kind of compliance in or double check in a world where digital communications are running on A/B tests and other things that may be more dynamic versus the standard static communications that we've kind of seen over time? Is that something that's being addressed at this point, or are we still kind of in the preparation phase for being able to manage that effectively?
I think it's still new,
Sure.
obviously. So we're A/B testing, but I think in the same way that, we're using AI to create these communications, we're also using AI to test these communications and make sure that they're actually going out properly and seeing what kind of responses we get from the consumers. And, just making sure that these processes are working in the way that they're supposed to.
Fair. I had not really considered that, right? And we've seen quite a few different AI compliance related tool sets on the marketplace, but the same technology that can be used to create something can be used to monitor something. So I find that to be interesting. But just kind of to the last point on our slide here, talking about rising tides raises all ships. I think that is a lot of what this commonality amongst due diligence has become. And if you talk about, even for example, the RMAI certification program and the receivable certified businesses that are being subjected to third-party audits and all of that, that's pushing everybody who's part of that program up, and those that are not participating in a program like that are then in a position to where they're at a disadvantage in the marketplace because they have not gone through that same procedural process. So I think it's interesting to see how this is going to continue to change over time. But I think a lot of people in our industry, we're getting news from the same places, we're learning from the same associations, we're reading the same rules and laws, we're seeing interpretations on webinars and in education sessions at conferences and whatnot. So it does kind of feel like it's almost a collaborative environment at this point for improving performance and compliance.
It does. And, I think audits used to have such a negative tone, and, it was a gotcha, like you did this wrong. And, looking at audits in such a scary way where, now it's kind of turning into like, how can we elevate this process? What can we do better? And I think the more that we're involved in an RMAI audit, an Everchain audit, your own vendor audits, I think you should look at it as a way, how can I improve my business and how can I close up any holes that might be there?
You make a great point there, right? Like, audits are not about gotcha. It's now about how can we optimize the opportunities available to us. And I think looking at it through that lens really is, that's incredibly important and insightful. I appreciate that. So in working with individual audits and working with individual vendors, annual audits has become a thing. And you also hear people talk about, when they're coming into the June, July timeframe each year, which is coming up quite quickly here. That's kind of become audit season. Right. And I think that's because so
Yep.
many of the debt buyers, agencies, and law firms find themselves in very cold places. And I think auditors just prefer to travel during the summer. I know at least that was always my methodology. Being a tropical person, I prefer to travel to the cold reaches of the country during the summer. But those annual audits, one, I think it's important that we be measuring things over the long term, right? And that it's a trust but verify type of situation. Like, we trust that you're doing the right thing. You were
Mhm.
doing the right thing when I was here last year, but I got to come in and verify once again. Have you seen any trends or changes with annual audits over the past few years?
I think kind of similarly to what I said earlier, we're looking to elevate, not gotcha. And it's also a relationship. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't know. I'm very proud of the things that we do at Everchain. And please come check our office, check our physical security. Like, we've worked so
Mhm.
hard to be as compliant as possible. I'm excited to show it to you. So I think, we have such good relationships with our clients, and going on site, it's kind of nice to see these people in person instead of just receiving, um, you know, filling in a spreadsheet of things that they are completing, or going back and forth through a platform. So I think it's also a way, we're in such a digital age and everyone's remote now. It's kind of nice to actually have an in-person relationship with your clients and just have a way to check in every year.
I agreed. I mean, the touch point is great, and it's not always the same touch point that you would get at a conference, right? Because conference meetings tend to be short and direct, right? Like 30 minutes to 60 minutes, generally max. But when somebody's coming in for an audit, it does really provide that nice touch point to where you get to spend a little bit of time together, and often time with the more operational people that you're working with day to day versus the executive team that you struck a deal with, or sold originally. I mean, it's different.
Yeah, and we have buyers that, they started out very
Mhm.
small, and, they're growing, and then they've taken some of the advice that we've given them from audits and put that into place. And it's really cool to see the evolution of, a lot of these buyers who started out here and now they're huge, and now it's so
Mhm.
impressive, and they're excited to show us, and I'm excited to see it. And just happy to have these relationships with our buyers.
I think it's incredibly important. So from your perspective, as in kind of the brokerage space, you've got your client is the creditor, so they're coming in to audit you, and then you're passing the same requirements downstream to the buyer and the vendors of that buyer, which kind of puts you in a unique position on some level. From an electronic compliance management standpoint, have you seen more of the debt buyers agencies and law firms leveraging electronic tracking and compliance management tool sets?
Absolutely. I've seen a lot of things move from folders and, Windows to a more robust compliance management
Mhm.
system that is, reminding them when they need to do things, keeping track of their contracts in a much better way. And it's cleaner, and it helps them be more efficient with, their tracking.
For me, it was always something that helped to fill in the gaps. So, like when we built a compliance management system, we built in things like license tracking so that I knew,
Yep.
90 days before an expiration that I needed to reach out and get those licenses. Insurance is going to expire. I need to make sure I have updated certificates on file in advance. And even being able on some level to automate the process of retrieving requesting and retrieving that documentation. And I feel like the application of this type of management tool set has reduced the labor burden on those that are being audited, because it just gives them a better a better management tool versus them sending out emails to their 25 different vendors for the 50 different licenses that each vendor has. Like, that's a lot of administrative paperwork being pushed around if you're not using some sort of a solution.
Absolutely. And we built that into our UDD system, our universal due diligence, which always tongue ties me for some reason. We built that into UDD, And it's just made, I mean, licensing alone, reminding our buyers that this license is due, having that automated, I mean, just that's a full FTE,
At least.
having the licensing automatically let the buyers know. So the automation from our end has been everything for our CMS.
Yeah, I would think so. Now, this is kind of an interesting one, right? When we talk about document repositories. And so, one of the things that I've found difficult through the years is everybody has these very different ways of managing their policies and procedures, right? You have some organizations that have an individual document for everything. And then you have other organizations that have a plan, and within that plan is all the policies and procedures related to that area, compliance management, accounting, whatever it may be. And everybody kind of manages it a little bit differently. Have you seen, it's been some time since I spent a lot of my individual time doing those audits, but have you seen any trends in the structure of that type of documentation?
Yes, and I think, I think it has to do with scale.
Okay.
I think when you're a small company and you're getting audited and someone asks for an SOP, you might, oh, we need this. So now we make it based on
Mhm.
that client. And I think what I see is the buyers that are focused on scale, they're thinking about having 100 clients instead of one, and they're building SOPs with, maybe they're consulting, maybe they're getting a consultant,
Mhm.
maybe they're getting, some good advice as to how they're going to scale their company, instead of, oh, we're doing all these little things for this client, this vendor, this client, this vendor. But when you're focusing on scale, I think your policies and procedures are a little more general, and you don't end up with, 300 SOPs.
Yeah, oh, agreed. But I think
to
that,
give to somebody like you that information.
well, that was part of the evolution, right? So when we talk about the
Mhm.
evolution of vendor management, originally you had a lot of people, like there was a lot of requests coming in. There was no master list of here's everything that you're going to need to provide. And every creditor, every debt buyer, everybody had their own standards that they were creating. The larger the organization, the more they were sticking to their own like individual standard, right? We saw a lot of that play out as compliance was becoming a more formidable force within each organization. But I always wondered how that started to taper out. When we got to the point of creating policies kind of on the fly based on specific needs and going back and trying to reorganize yourself in a way that made sense. For me, one of the tricks that I used through the years was just making sure I numbered all my paragraphs. So when I had I'd go into my policies and procedures and I would number everything. The technology plan is number 8, and then the purpose is 8.1, 8.2, right? And I kind of built out my documentation that way, even into the sub paragraphs. But that way, when I had a spreadsheet or an RFI that came across, they were like, okay, here's the questions that we have, and I need you to provide supporting documentation for each. It enabled me to answer by saying, okay, well, you've got plans 1 through 13, so go to 8.1.7.6.4, and that is the policy answer right there. I found that to be incredibly effective in terms of being able to manage it, but it also helped me on an annual basis when I was auditing. So if I was going back to audit those policies and procedures and I can see that the numbers are way off, now I can get a better feel for what has changed and where within that massive structure of documentation.
Yep.
So, I mean, just one of the tricks that I used through the years, because it really did make a huge difference for me when I was able to organize to that finite of a level. And believe me, it's not something that like I even came up with overnight. Like that was an evolution based on the problems that I was facing each time I was creating documentation. And then not just creating documentation, but then applicable, applying it to an actual business problem. It's great to write all these documents, but if I can't then use those in the function of my business, then what have I really done other than a giant exercise in what ifs?
Well, I mean, a lot of compliance is just organization,
Mhm.
right? And anticipating what you might need this one
Mhm.
thing for, right? So I think, part of the evolution is moving from just organization. It's important to be incredibly organized, but also how do we automate that organization? And that, kind of helps with these RFPs. If you have, a compliance management system in place and you need this, can you just search, what this RFP is asking for, and that will pop up the SOP that you need. So the organization and the optimization just really kind of plays together, I think, when you're, trying to get your ducks in a row for whatever you're going to need them in a row for.
Well, in the early days, this was a great way for me to leverage my ADHD in a way in which I could take all of this information and start putting it into piles, and then take those piles and start working through each one of the categorizations there, and continue to refine. But that distillation process for me was incredibly valuable because everything started as this giant mess, right?
Yep.
Pile of needs, and then we had to kind of categorize those needs and work our way down for each one of them. But I feel like there was a lot of bilateral assistance throughout this evolution, meaning it wasn't just the master telling everybody else what to do. It wasn't somebody sitting at the top of the pyramid telling everybody else what they had to do. That might have been a little bit more prevalent early on in the evolution of vendor management. But I think as we've gotten to this point, it's become this conversational back and forth. And I feel like I've been in a number of meetings over the past couple of years where a debt buyer is being questioned, by a creditor about one of their particular policies, and they're able to articulate and explain it in a way that the creditor goes, "Oh, I should probably do that. Like, maybe I should look at it under this lens, or maybe I need to rethink the way that I'm requiring this." And I do believe that kind of change in the mentality of it has gone back to all the ships rising with the tide. But I feel like that's definitely a change that I've seen, or a trend that I've seen over time.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we're even seeing, I feel like we're educating our creditors a lot on the debt sale process, where, as the buyers have RMAI and we're also involved with RMAI and we have that resource, the creditors don't really know. They lend, that's their business. And that's what their bread and butter is. And then when it comes to debt sales, like, we're really having to educate them and give them assistance as to what they should be doing and what their best practices are and what's the most compliant way to sell debt. So it's, it's not just on the buyer. It's the creditors need, a lot of bilateral assistance as well, as to do this in the best, most compliant, profitable way.
Well, helping them to learn from the mistakes of others is incredibly important, because we know that, debt buying or debt sales is a byproduct of the lending business, and it's not a massive byproduct. It's not generally going to be 20% of their portfolio. It's going to be a rather small subset, which means that it gets a rather small subset of technology resources, of other resources. And so you got to be real specific up front and provide as much education as you can so that they can vie for those internal resources, right? Try and get those resources to work with. I think that bi-directional conversation has really taken flight over the past couple of years. And I'm looking forward to see where it goes. And I part of that, I think, early on. Sorry, internet glitches here. But as we look at, originally things were viewed as a yes or no, right? It was like does this meet my expectation? Yes, no. But I feel like things have become more of a measurement of risk tolerance, and that organizations that are auditing, whether it be their vendors or their debt buyers, are now looking at it and saying, what is my risk tolerance for this particular subject, right? Like, am I okay with these digital communications? And I'll use let's take our time machine back for a minute and let's go pre-Reg F for a minute, right? You had some creditors who were like, yeah, use digital communications. We have a risk tolerance for that. We believe that this is an effective methodology and well within the law. Then you had others that said, I don't have defined terms, and I don't have anything in the law that says that this is acceptable, so I'm not going to do this. But I feel like it went more from that yes, no to this, like, what's my tolerance for this particular area, or what's our organizational tolerance? Have you seen it in that same kind of mind frame?
I feel like we kind of see it every day, right? So what we do at Everchain is we have a buyer scorecard. So if our lenders are selling and they receive bids on their portfolios, they can see the compliance score for that buyer. We have some sellers that will go, it shows their complaints, it shows their insurance, their licenses, it just gives them complete transparency into, really, the risk of this buyer. And, we see a lot of sellers that will go with the second place bid. It's less money, but their compliance score is higher. So, it kind of gives you a good snapshot into, what that seller's risk tolerance is. And, we see a lot that say, no, I'll go with the more compliant buyer instead of just the highest price, which is really interesting.
Well, the outlier from a pricing standpoint often, represents risk, right? If one person's willing to pay, 50% more for a product than everybody else, we all know from those of us that were around in that, as we went through that whole economic crisis, those that were willing to take more risk, found themselves having to feed the beast. So they overpaid for a product, and now they're going to potentially start considering cutting corners because they need to make their loan payment or whatever the case may be. But that risk tolerance level definitely changed over time. With that being said, when we talk about new products, and I know this is an area that you spend a lot of time in, which is kind of moving into new products and then educating those creditors on those new products. So I think this is an interesting part of our conversation today. When we talk a little bit here about, there's differences to these different products, right? And so buy now, pay later being one, fintech being another, that, fintech's not that new anymore, right? It's been around for effectively 5 to 7 years, and it's still continuing to refine itself, right? Like, it's still identifying new opportunities, and I don't know that the innovation is going to stop in that sector anytime soon, but that ultimately is going to require some tweaking in terms of the communication methods that are selected, the risk tolerance levels that are going to be acceptable. And so talk to me a little bit about what it's like trying to educate a new creditor, that really has just not been familiar with debt sales. Like, you're educating them on what their expectations should be of a debt buyer or agency or law firm. Like, how do you put that into context for them?
I think, first of all, everyone's typically scared of the unknown, right? The fintech, it's hard to explain at first, right? How this loan originated, who owns it, and when. It's difficult to understand at first, and I think we've been in this fintech space for quite some time, and now we're all starting to get it. But like you said, education. I think providing transparency and education, and just giving that creditor all the information that you can, and that also means just having a lot of conversations, understanding exactly where this loan came from, understanding exactly how it was originated. Did someone go into a bank branch and fill out an application on an iPad, or is this person just on their phone? Finding out as much information as you can really helps the buyer understand what they're buying, helps the creditor market it. So I think with either product or any new product that we're going to see, we have to do our due diligence into figuring out everything we can about that loan, figuring out every piece, every piece of ownership, understanding how the consumer was introduced to the loan, and what happened to it. The more information we can get is helpful to both sides, and giving both sides transparency into what that loan looked like.
So let me ask you from kind of this perspective, right? When you've got a creditor who's coming into the marketplace with a new fintech type product, right? And so now you've got to help them to measure or establish the risk tolerance that they're willing to accept, right?
Mhm.
Are you seeing differences in the compliance expectations based on product type? Like, are you seeing different expectations from fintech versus auto versus credit card, or is it more organizational driven?
It depends. The legal and compliance in me doesn't like risk. But I think they're just, we're used to selling credit cards, we're used to selling autos.
Yeah.
Everybody feels very comfortable with those. So I just think the risk tolerance is lower when there's anything newer, just because it's unknown, and that makes sense, right? This is something new.
Sure.
Our risk tolerance should be lower for anything that we're not familiar selling, and that we haven't seen what the errors, we haven't seen what could go wrong. So the risk tolerance is lower, and it should be.
Well, fear of the unknown is the greatest fear.
Right.
Right. It's there's nothing you can fear more than the unknown. So I think that's an interesting it's an interesting way of looking at it, and kind of learning those nuances and how those nuances are going to apply to various product types, and making the adjustments that need to be made, whether it be through educating them from a risk tolerance perspective, or it's more about really just trying to better understand those individual products, the documentation that's required. I mean, even talking about auto, which is a product that's been around as long as the industry's been around, understanding the what they call the green card laws, and all of the different aspects that fall under various state jurisdictions, and looking at those mixes and being able to evaluate that documentation. I find that to be kind of an interesting piece, but then all of that has to get passed down to the vendor, because if you're bringing this new product into the space, the debt buyer buys it. Now it's going to go down to the vendors. So not only are you educating up to the creditor, but now you're educating down to all of these other participants in the collections process. And in doing that, I think it's interesting to see kind of how organizations are reacting to some of those differentiations. Because I'll give you an example, and so I've hired a lot of agencies and been through the evaluation process with agencies, fairly regularly. And the one thing that I never want to hear is I'm good at everything. When I ask somebody what they're good at and they say everything, the conversation has ended.
Yeah.
I'm no longer paying attention. Right. But if they tell me that they are the absolute best at auto loans between 3,500 and 7,500 in the Southwest corridor of the United States, it feels very, very different to me. All right, we had a question just come up here that we could try and address. How do you conceive TOR clients to collect more information to improve compliance? They are originators and have high default rate tolerance. So I think what Bill's asking here is, what are you doing to convince your clients to collect more information regarding compliance? So if you're talking to a creditor, how are you communicating with them that they need to be collecting this information from a compliance standpoint if they have a high default rate in their product line already, maybe a payday loan or something else, that they're buy here, pay here?
I mean, our buyers are going to want that information when they bid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, while there is also the obvious compliance aspect to that of collecting that information, they're also going to probably sell their loans for a higher amount if they're collecting that information, and we can provide that transparency to the buyer. So that's, again, a balance of performance and compliance, where you're increasing your compliance by collecting that data, but you're also increasing the price that you're going to sell your debt for.
Fair. I think that there's an economic component to that. I would also say, and I think from what Bill's asking here, Bill, if you've got a client or you've got an originator that's used to high default, right? That's one thing. If they're not driven by the need to be compliant, then is it a client that you want? Right? If they don't have compliance ingrained in their mind frame and you're explaining it and they're just not willing to listen, then it may not be the right product for you.
I 100% agree with that as well.
It's never fun to walk away from a deal, right? Nobody wants to walk away from deals and opportunities.
When it looks scary though, and you can see that there's too much risk, it's okay to walk away.
If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So just avoid a situation you already know is not going to be a good one for you in the long run, because there's no point in grinding water, so to speak. So then we talk a little bit about evolving with Reg F, right? So as now we've kind of talked about the evolution of where we started in 2017, how this has started to evolve and change, but now we're kind of getting into present day, right? And so as we went through the Reg F changes and all the requirements that were embedded within that rule, it's a lot to unpack here. So I'm not going to ask you as an attorney to give us the full, rundown on Reg F, because I don't think anybody wants to hear the same thing again. But let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you guys faced from a compliance standpoint. So educating that creditor on what is going to have to happen. And I'm assuming playing a little bit of referee in the center here early on, because you got a buyer saying, I need these things. You've got the creditor saying, how am I supposed to get them these things? And you're kind of in the middle there playing referee and guiding each team or each side of the equation back to an equalibrium.
Yeah,
What's that like?
I know we were all Reg F to death. So when you brought it up, I was like, everyone's probably rolling their eyes already. But yeah, I think the biggest thing for us were the data files, making sure that we had the appropriate data headers from our sellers and letting them know very, very early what is required. And then we have a validation system within our platform as well. So we can make sure that buyer can see the exact, everywhere that this balance came from, every fee, just making sure it's so clear for the buyer how that balance was calculated, and making sure that each data field makes sense, adds up, and can validate before we even put it on the platform for our buyers.
Fair. I mean, if that's what is required to get the file loaded, right? Like for the file to be imported into a platform, then that is what's required, right? Like There's really no way around it. But you also don't want either side just running their head into a wall, right? You don't want them not unable to do it. Did you guys supply like additional resources or technology resources? Like, were there any tips or tricks that you used to reduce the friction in the process?
A lot of training and just a lot of help help during the process, letting them know what was going to be expected, how we're going to do it. And, we don't want to put anything on our platform that it's not very clear as to where that balance came from. So it wasn't as bad as it sounds.
Yeah, it wasn't as bad as it could have been.
Yeah. It was, we were very clear about our expectations, very clear what they were going to need, very clear what our buyers were going to require to comply with Reg F. So I think just keeping the expectations clear really helped with implementing these changes.
So then from a written communication review, I think a lot of organizations moved over to the safe harbor letter.
Yep.
Like that was the big push for them. And I won't belabor that too much, but I think also the communication frequency was another one of those items that required a systematic update. And granted, we had a year, a lot of people, spent that year working through the challenges that they were going to face in terms of tracking, storing, managing that information, and being able to ultimately prove how many times they've tried to contact that consumer over a period of time, because it's ultimately your defensible position,
right,
should something else come down. Is that something that you guys are tracking on an account level basis, or is that really more the responsibility of the organization that's collecting?
I think I lost the end of the question, but I think I know what it was. So
Okay.
when it comes to written communications and the frequency of each communication, that's another way that we kind of prepared our buyers as to what would be expected, and kind of held their hands through that in preparing for these Reg F changes.
Fair. I'm sorry, like internet's being a little glitchy today here. So let's talk a little. We've got 10 minutes left or 9 minutes left in our discussion today. Let's talk for a minute about the exceptions for compliance and the expectations for compliance in the future, because I feel like there's still a lot that's happening in our marketplace, and I'm not going to try and predict what happens next, but I think an interesting part of our discussion is so we've talked about how the world of vendor management has evolved to its current point in time, but now that it is here, we're working through all the things we've learned to this point. Now we're starting to look out into the future and saying, how is this going to impact us, and how can we be prepared for this? So obviously we're always dealing with regulatory issues. I feel like that's just part of life as a debt buyer, as an agency, as a law firm, right? Like that's
Yeah,
part of our world. But ballot initiatives is new.
ballot initiatives. Our friend Amber Russo, who's working on those in Arizona, that was kind of a curveball that we didn't expect. We expect all of these regulatory CFPB. We expect that to increase. We expect that to be a cloud over our heads at all times, helping us. We're making us improve. And but the ballot initiatives, that is another tool against us, I guess, or another thing that we have to be conscious of at all times. And your next bullet was technology changes. I just think we need to, as we see technology for collections activity, improve and change, we just need to think of ways that we can use that technology to also track it and to also keep it as compliant as possible. If the text messaging is new, and that's something that people hadn't thought of 10 years ago. So I think every new technology that helps with collections, we need to think about how we can use technology to keep that particular means compliant as well.
Fair. From an electronic communication standpoint, do you think that now that Reg F is out, that more organizations are becoming comfortable with sending digital communications?
I do, and that's what we're seeing. How often do I check my mail? Not very often, but I'm looking at my phone at least 10 times a day. That's a low ball number for that. But, I just think collections is going to mimic the way we live our lives. And, we're silly to think that electronic communications aren't going to increase.
Fair. So that leaves us to kind of our final point for today's discussion, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I know that this has been a hot regulatory topic as organizations are starting to look at, what's inside the black box and those kinds of things. And I find this is going to be a challenge. Any insights, from your perspective in terms of the application of artificial intelligence in the collection space?
I think we're going to see it increase. We're using AI for everything now. I mean, people. It's kind of an animal that we're not sure how we're going to control it or where it's going. So I would be, also surprised if that wasn't used in the collection space as well.
Agreed. I think that we're going to see more regulatory questioning around its usage. I think we'll start to see it more happen on the lending side, where you've got redlining laws, other things that are more related to the underwriting and kind of the lending of money versus what we're doing in collections. I feel like that's probably going to have a bigger impact for an organization like the CFPB prior to putting collections under the microscope for the same thing, because I feel like we're going to learn a lot of our lessons from the creditors themselves, those with resources, the power, the energy, the money to put those kinds of tools in place. And then we're going to learn from what we see in that market. But I don't see it just taking off and running totally wild. We saw the chat GDP, and then there was the Dan or do anything now command, which broke the safety and security layer. So I think the more basic machine learning and trying to understand the technology and how things are calculated and learning from organizing and sorting and managing the data that we've collected through the years is going to be where we start to use it the most. Although I'm sure we're going to use some communication methods and other things, whether it be A/B testing or voice or chat tool sets in the future as well. But I don't think artificial intelligence is going anywhere. I think that that's going to be part of the future evolution of vendor management when we can better understand how to put metrics and measurements around the use of these tool sets.
Absolutely agree.
So with all of that being said, if anybody has any final questions you'd like to drop into the chat here, we'd be happy to try and cover those in the last 3 minutes here. But Brooke, I just wanted to say thank you for coming on and chatting with me again today. I really do appreciate when you come on and share your insights, whether it be a webinar, roundtable, where we get the chance to kind of have these chats.
Great. It was a great conversation, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Look forward to doing another one with you in the future here. Thank you, everybody, for watching today, and we will talk to you again soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.